All right. Hello, everyone who's just joining. We are giving it just a few more minutes to allow folks to join before we get the discussion started. But thanks so much for being here today, and we will get the conversation rolling in just a few moments.
It looks like Naomi is in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Promote to panelist. Here we go. There we go. Hi, Naomi. Sorry, you were lost in Zoom land there for a moment, but I think we have you in the right place now.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are just going to give it 1 or 2 more minutes, I think, just for a few more audience members if they want to hop onto the webinar, but then we'll get the conversation rolling very soon.
How are things at UCLA?
Kind of the same everywhere, I'm thinking. Yeah. Good topic for today's conversation. All right, we'll just give it one more moment. Thanks to everybody who's joined, but we'll get the conversation rolling just 1 more minute. All right, well, we'll go ahead and start our conversation. We're so thankful to all of you for being present today, both our panelists and those that are joining in the audience. This is a webinar brought to you by First Publix, and our focus today is on teaching sociological research methods in times of crisis. And we have with us today three really wonderful panelists who have agreed to speak from their own experience on this topic. We've prepared some questions for the panelists to address, and we'll do that for a while, and then we'll have time for some Q&A from the audience after that. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce each panelist and then kick off the conversation with our first question. So joining us today is Dr. Patricia Richards, who is professor of sociology and women's studies at the University of Georgia and author of the book Harassed: Gender, Bodies, and Ethnographic Fieldwork. Dr. Richards studies political sociology, globalization, gender, social movements, and development and social change. She's an award-winning teacher scholar. Her research has been recognized by the Mellon Foundation, affirming Multivocal Humanities Initiative, and she has received multiple teaching awards, including the prestigious Josiah Miggs Distinguished Teaching Professorship from the University of Georgia. Dr. Richards is also well known for her practice and instruction of feminist research methods and pedagogy. So welcome, Patricia. We also have joining us Dr. Steve McKay, who is professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the director of the UCSC Center for Labor and Community. His research focuses on labor, gender, migration, racial formation, and globalization. Dr. McKay has been recognized for both his teaching and research over the course of his career, receiving the Sociology of Labor Distinguished Book Award from the ASA section of Labor and Labor Movements, the Community Game Changer Award, from the United Way of Santa Cruz County and the Community Hero Award from the Community Action Board of Santa Cruz County, as well as the Golden Apple Award for Outstanding Teaching from the UCSC Division of Social Sciences. Dr. McKay has been working with colleagues Rebecca London and Miriam Greenberg to develop and share their model for community-initiated student-engaged research, or CISR, which contributes to student learning outcomes, persistence to graduation, and inclusivity for students from historically underrepresented groups. So welcome, Dr. McKay. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Naomi Shugi, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Shugi studies the relationship between criminal legal contact and inequality across various domains, including crime, health, families, employment, welfare, and voting, using diverse methodological approaches for data collection and analysis. Of note, her prison pandemic project created a digital archive of personal stories contributed by people incarcerated in California prisons, jails, and immigration detention facilities during the COVID-19 pandemic to demonstrate how people incarcerated, their loved ones, and staff and officers who work in these facilities experienced this public health crisis. Additionally, Dr. Shugi is experienced in teaching social science research methods, having taught courses in writing and field study, digital media archiving, and graduate methods. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Shugi. To kick it off, we'd like to just talk generally about the role of teaching sociological methods in this particular moment. So we're in a moment that I know we all are living and understanding as day by day, but we're in this context of the distrust towards science in general, social science in particular, attacks on the academy and social science research. So how would you all describe the role that sociological research methods play during this time? In other words, what's the value of teaching research methods right now, given the contemporary polycrisis that we find ourselves in? And if you wouldn't mind, Patricia, could we kick it off with you?
Sure, I'm happy to start us off on this one. So, as you said, Sarah, I come to this panel as somebody who teaches feminist methodologies in an interdisciplinary program, though I sometimes teach qualitative methods in sociology too, but I just want to sort of start with the general caveat that I'm speaking here mostly as someone with investments in feminist research methodologies. And in terms of the context of distrust of science and everything else you mentioned, feminist research is one of the kinds of research that's really on the front lines and has historically been on the front lines. When you ask questions and research topics that challenge the status quo, that challenge power, that's where you're going to find yourself. And it's not always an uncomfortable place to be, as I was reminded this morning when we got an open records request on our Mellon multivocality grant. But it's a location from which we already know, as Audre Lorde taught us decades ago, that our silence will not protect us. To put this in terms into the terms of debate being discussed in many sociology departments and elsewhere in the academy these days, silence around issues that matter, issues of gender and racial and colonial inequality and oppression, for example, silence around these issues is not going to save us. So feminist methodologies, as I teach them, have three main components. They start by making the everyday world the problematic, and they do so in order to demystify structures of domination. They are anti-oppressive and action-oriented in some respect, and they're grounded in reflexivity, or subjecting the researcher to the same level of scrutiny that we subject our research participants. I feel like these organizing values for doing research are highly relevant at this moment And in teaching feminist methods this semester, it's been impossible to not talk about the poly crisis and the challenges and affordances of feminist research in this context. And I think I'll just sort of end by saying that I think that there are many of both, so many challenges and many affordances as well.
Thank you. Thanks. Steve, would welcome your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, it's a big one. But I think one thing is that is to understand some of the attacks, and some of it, particularly from the right, is a populist one, right? And it's an anti-elite one. But that from the right gets paired with an anti-liberal bias, right? So an attack on science. But it's fundamentally an attack on elitism. And so if we think about it in part in that way, and useful Patricia to think about in a feminist way in terms of, laden with all this power, is then to think about, well, like universities are on their heels trying to defend themselves because they're getting tagged as elite, as irrelevant, and like they're having a hard time defending themselves sometimes, right? Because we can be absolutely elite, so what are universities doing? Sometimes they're trying to reassert their public missions. I'm in a public university to demonstrate their value beyond the academy, right? So that's one of the things, and that's not a bad thing that they have to do. For me, I'm a product from K to PhD of public institutions. So come out of California, and so I'm in this for the public mission. And so some of those, we've been rallying against the university to be, actually attentive to a lot of these issues of power and of the marginalized as a public institution. So, but it's sort of how do we direct that public mission? And that's where it gets this in terms of polycrisis is sort of understanding the kind of power relations and where do we kind of step in. And so I'm kind of maybe as Patricia, I'm an accidental methodologist. I came at this in part because my research often involves working with community partners and involving my students in that kind of collaborative endeavor. And in that way, I was teaching classes just in my regular topics. So I'm a labor sociologist. I taught a class on work and society, but I had a partner, the California Rural Legal Assistants, who said, "Well, that's great. You teach this stuff, but we have a research need. We want to better know what's happening with low-wage workers that coming out of agriculture into low-wage services. We sit in our office and we're not sure what's going on out there, but we're seeing different things coming here. Can you help us understand what's going on?" And I'm like, well, I'm an ethnographer. Before this, I worked by myself. Am interested in that topic, but I realized like if they drive the question, it becomes publicly relevant and important. And so I hijacked my regular classes, taught and trained my students in research, survey research. Um, and then my department got mad at me for me hijacking my class because then we went on to look at low wage, we looked at affordable housing and we looked at immigrant belonging. And they're like, you can't keep doing that. So I said, well, give me another opportunity to teach a different course. And so we created what's called the Community Engaged Research Practicum. And so now that's my main methods course that I teach several times a year where we prepare students, but it's linked to a project. So in that sense, the polycrisis and how do we respond in some ways is to hear from our collaborators, our partners, what's needed, and then kind of reverse engineering it in that sense. And so for me, I come at methods with an attention to what's the issue and problem that our partners, given that we're a public mission, and sometimes it's student driven. We've done projects that are student focused. So for me, it's like, well, when I can link my research and the methods. So every good question has to have the right methods to answer it. So our methods change. And for me, that means I get to learn more about doing oral histories, or I get to do, different survey research. So depending on what's driven from the community. So for me, it's like there's no end of projects to possibly do. It's then selecting how to work with different partners and what's doable from where we sit. So So for me, in thinking about the current context, it's sort of, well, how do we engage um, students and our partners in dealing with the poly crisis?
Awesome. Well, speaking of crises and engaging with community, Naomi, could you speak a little bit to this question?
Yeah, I want to say first of all that there are so many crises going on at this moment, like has already been mentioned, and I want to just focus on one of these, which is around retreat from data and information and knowledge, just kind of
Mm.
generally across lots of different domains. And this, you can see this in terms of removal of data sets from federal government websites. You can see this in the dismantling of agency resources, of researcher resources, and staff to kind of support data gathering and dissemination. And so I think that I I just want to draw attention to that crisis, which is like a crisis of non-transparency, which is something that in my area of the criminal legal system, we have increasingly been trying to push against over. So it's not a new thing, but but the kind of seepage of this into all sorts of other domains as well has really been alarming, I think. And in this sort of context, I think that research methods in particular are so important to both equip people with tools to kind of be consumers and discerning information, but then also being producers to collect data to try to kind of keep the data and the knowledge and the information out there about these different institutions. And so, going back, Sarah, Shannon, to your question about community partnerships, um, in prison pandemic, which you so nicely described in the opening, during the COVID pandemic, we were faced with a very similar type of issues and concerns about non-transparency. During this crisis, we're wondering what is happening in prisons and jails and immigration detention facilities during COVID, during the pandemic, and really only getting information from official channels through administrative data, what people were willing to share in press releases, very tailored, kind of filtered, highly stylized information. And so this is really where the role of sociology and sociologists, sociological research methods come into play to bring transparency to these sorts of crisis situations where things are hidden and it's not clear what is happening. And so with prison pandemic, what we ended up doing was it was really in response to community partners and their concerns that there were some terrible, terrible things happening in our prisons and jails that we just weren't able to hear about. Traditional sort of channels like the media often want you to speak on the record. And during times of crisis, especially among vulnerable groups, there's a real concern about retaliation. And so some of these more, some of these other ways of expression really aren't available in contexts of power and vulnerability and marginalization. And so what we ended up doing was we were just going to collect a few stories from people who wanted to talk about what's happened, who are incarcerated in prisons and jails in California, to talk about what was going on. And we worked with community partners to solicit those stories. And we thought, okay, this is the, end of summer 2020, midst of the COVID pandemic. We will put these up on our professional website, just our kind of institutional professional website. My website, that has my CV. I'll put these stories up because we were just expecting to have kind of like a handful of stories. And we ended up embarking on this really massive project where we ended up collecting over 4,000 stories from people who wanted to share about what was happening in California prisons, jails, immigration detention facilities, and putting them up on a website. When we worked with community partners the entire way, they structured so many of our practices from the initially even doing the project to then finding ways to do it in an ethical way that would really mitigate concerns about retaliation. And then even now thinking about how to redact information and process information in a way that will align with community partner preferences around the archive. And even in our dissemination of the project, so we have something like over 4,000 stories, like I said, but they're on our website, and people incarcerated in prisons cannot access websites. So the very people who contributed stories are not able to access their stories or see other people's stories. So, our community partners were really important in helping us disseminate a printed book of stories. So we ended up printing a subset of stories and artwork that was contributed to the project, and you help with the help of our community partners, disseminating those books to California prisons and jails. And so I think in times of crises, oftentimes community members are the ones who are really closest to understanding the changing environment, like the rapidly changing environment. And so, especially in prison pandemic, it really was a response to community members voicing concern and shining a light on an area that needed to be talked about.
Thank you all. This is, yeah, touching on so many important themes, I think, here, both like not staying silent, but also fear of retaliation, lack of transparency, engaging with the public, engaging with our students, and then trying to kind of hold it all together ourselves, right? So I'm curious how you all may be engaging with these things like in the classroom. Are these conversations that are coming up that are students asking these kinds of questions in your conversations about methods? And in particular, maybe Naomi, you brought up this issue around data and how we can help students discern what is good data, what's not. How can we collect data ethically and accurately in a time when we're really having to question all of those things? So I'll let whoever would like to kind of address that question first.
I can go. It's important, and Naomi, thank you for your project. And it made me think about what happens is in kind of crisis, and what we know is that some stories are just never heard. And so one way to come at it, partly in classes, is we get a chance if you participate in gathering data, you get a sense of what is quality data, right? Like and who is not heard and who actually holds knowledge. And so, and so traditional kind of methods is about like, how to handle data, making sure it's rigorous. So it's another approach, and this is much, a very feminist approach to looking at, knowledge, who holds it, and when and what my students experience when they go out and talk to folks is about like, people are reticent to share, and so our students often share a background with the folks that they're interviewing, and that's partly why they're like, I hadn't been into research, but I get to go in a community that looks like mine. I can use my language skills, talk to people, and man, I get way better stories than I'm seeing in the paper or from some other source. And so they get an understanding that if we build the relationship with the folks that we're interested in learning from, then we get better data. And and so we're interested in kind of traditional ideas of rigor and validity, reflexivity, and ethics, but in a more critical, participatory way. But that's for me a way to teach them about being skeptical. How was that research collected? What was the wording on that survey? Who asked these folks? right? You can
Mhm.
imagine like trying to do a survey of incarcerated folks that was done by the wardens. What kind of quality would that be? And so I think, that perspective of when you work in partnership, we see the quality difference. And that's a real teachable moment in the classroom from participating outside the classroom.
Mhm.
That's great. Patricia, do you want to add?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just like it was really exciting to hear Steve talking about this the way he did, oh, sorry, I have a movable desk here. And also just the learning through doing being so absolutely critical. And when you're working with community partners and really thinking about the source of knowledge and how knowledge is constructed every step of the way, and being really kind of collectively reflexive about that in classes, I think that that's absolutely key. I think that beyond the kind of learning through doing, I think that there are other ways, that we can kind of do this too, but again, the skills have to be taught explicitly. And so I think that, on the other side of this, we can also ask students to assign, give assignments that explicitly ask students to assess the credibility of what they're reading and to really look at, work that they're consuming. And asking questions about the research process every step of the way. And so trying to provide those lists of questions and assignments that do that sort of thing. In addition, I think that knowing the history of our disciplines is a crucial part of this too. And again, it's, this is a question of like unmasking how all knowledge is interested, right? So I think that too few of us know the history of sociology's, how sociology came to be, and what Steinmetz calls, for example, just one example, Steinmetz's work describing the emergence of crypto-positivism. And so I think that in too few of our methods classes, we even give consideration to the epistemological assumptions of the methods that we're using. And so beyond kind of the community-oriented research that some of our students in the Institute are engaged in, I also think it's really important to explicitly teach about these issues and to teach students to really think about the assumptions going into the research they're consuming as well as the research that they're doing. It's the fact that knowledge is not independent of power relations that leads to this retreat from data that Naomi was talking about. And then at the same time, though, I feel strongly that given that knowledge is not independent of power relations, that really means that knowledge ought to be used towards positive change and ending oppression in all forms. But then it becomes a little sticky, right? Because we want non-transparency or we want transparency. We want to end non-transparency. But students often want to believe that if we do good research, we can prove some truth, right? We can prove the truth of our position. But I think that it's that one of the hardest things about teaching methods is teaching that there's more to it than that, and really calling on students to recognize the ways that all knowledge is situated, and thus, regardless, particular investments and values enter into the production of research and also the consumption of research. And so, you think about, like, even if you had a really good study that shows, the implications of the lack of universal healthcare in a particular community or, across the nation, what people do with that study will look completely different depending on the values that they're bringing to the table. And so for me, this means that the storytelling component of our research is incredibly important. How do we tell compelling stories? This can't be an underestimated part of what we teach. And telling compelling stories requires the insights and skills that are derived from the humanities and the critical social sciences on things like ethics, values, how ideology works, how to form a well-founded line of argumentation, and so forth. So I think that, given our contemporary reality, all of these polycrises, all of these crises that make up the polycrisis, as well as just the AI revolution, I think that all of this stuff just really brings to the fore the relevance of the critical social sciences and the humanities more than ever.
I was waiting for someone to bring the monster of AI into
Yeah.
the conversation. Thank you, Patricia. I knew I could count on you. No, this is all, I feel like we really have our work cut out for us, right? Naomi, is there anything that you'd like to add just in terms of the classroom perspective on how you see these issues coming into play?
Yeah, first I'll just say, Steve and Patricia, really, yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. I'm actually teaching graduate methods right now, this quarter, and I've seen it come into play in so many ways. It's impossible, I guess, to think about sociological research and methods without the broader context coming into play into the classroom. And it comes into play in all sorts of ways. I'm not going to repeat some of the themes that Steve and Patricia already said, but I will say, in terms of being critical consumers of research, it comes into play in those ways where, you know, we're hearing all sorts of claims being made. I can remember a class discussion around Tylenol, right? And assessing the effects of Tylenol and the claims around Tylenol. And so, I think sociological methods have so many direct things to say about trying to assess claims like that, right? And so we talked all about the differences between correlation and causation, which is a really, really important tool and piece of skill set for students to know about when they're making critical assessments about things that they're hearing in the media and from the administration. The other thing I'll say is I think that, so when I teach methods, including this quarter, I always start at the very beginning with a week on ethics. And it's not ethics, it is ethics partly about the IRB and that process, but it's much, much broader than that. And it's the idea that ethics really does inform all aspects of the research process and research methods. From beginning through all the way through dissemination. And so we start with that. And I think that in this environment, that discussion just becomes very, very, very important in a way that may not have been as obvious in prior years teaching it, but it's really at the forefront these days. And so I'll just end with that note.
Yeah, great. Excellent point. So obviously politics, both big P and little p, are always at play when we teach really anything, but methods again in this moment is our focus. And I'm curious what you all see as the political implications or policy possibilities, that you imagine or try to enact in your courses. One example is, creating a sense of obligation to community or addressing pressing social issues, as all of you have already in some way touched upon. But in what ways do you think that research methods courses can really serve as a catalyst for meaningful community partnerships or transformative work, even that extends outside the academy? Steve, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. In lots of ways, it's an important question. I guess for me, a couple of things that, our approach is critical and thus it's political, right? We're situated politically. And so we, try in some ways pursue projects that are meaningful to our community partners. But we start always with two really simple questions when we start with our community partners. What do you know but can't prove? And what do you need to know to do your work better? And it's a really simple thing, but that if we use that to drive our research agenda, then we're responsive to our partners, and we see that time and again. And it's again like, like it we want to we're walking together, right? This is a whole point. We bring different skills to it, so our partners know what's going on, or have access and ideas, but we also know how to do research, and so it's useful for them to have us, but it's critical that they drive it. So there can be a division of labor, but if there's a division of labor where we hold all the power, then that's a problem. But if there's a division of labor where they get to set the agenda and be involved in it, then we can go about doing our work in tandem that's going to be and truly co-produce it. That's going to be useful to them. And so for us, that often bumps up against power, right? In all our projects. And so in some ways it becomes political. How that's used politically, we're not always driving it. So for example, we are just studying affordable housing, right? Like the big crisis, California and so many places, affordable housing and rent. So we help document like cost of living and rent burdens, calculating rent burdens for students and renters. Well, students and renters, we had a real big town gown divide, it's typical in university towns. And the town is always blaming the students for driving up rent. Well, it was like, well, students are renters and renters are renters, why can't they see each other as that? And so that's what happened. The students went around and helped document this for all of our county, getting 2,000 surveys about the rent burden. And together they created a coalition that pushed for a rent control campaign. Right. So there's these ways that the project, and again, it came out of partly our students, but our students seeing in collaboration with others. And it was a rare time that the community and the university, but that was where then people in the community said, wow, that's the university being useful. That's a public institution. And so to us, it can become political in that way. Something Patricia said is really important, the narrative. So one thing after we do that, we kind of have this ethos of, approaching projects in terms of DNA. We use it, dative, narrative, and action. Right. And to think about that, like as you're designing a project with your partners, because we've had projects where we're interested in, but our partners, there was no action component. And so we documented all this stuff. Uh, this wasn't the case, wage theft, but we didn't have like we're working on a particular campaign. So we documented with it, but it didn't, and it helped our partner a little bit, but there wasn't a bigger kind of action related to it. But having the data, so one thing that helps for us is involving students lets us scale up the kind of research that's more useful. So sometimes narratives are important, but our partners say, yeah, but we always show up at city council meetings and we have lots of stories. And they said that we want to see the data, right? And so then they're like, when we don't have that, we don't have the capacity to do that. So we're like, okay, well, we can help collect that and our students can help. And so we always shoot for like 2,000, 3,000 surveys, right? Not a huge county. And then, use our skills to weight stuff. And then we can do this ways that then we also collect stories with our partners, and that tandem of data and narrative, but attached to an ask and an action has been our most successful kind of project. So it's that kind of intentionality to begin with it, helps it in different ways. That's just been our approach.
That's great. Naomi?
Yeah, I think, gosh, there's so many ways to answer this sort of question about political implications and possibilities. Maybe I'll say that I think that our students come to, especially I'm thinking of the graduate students right now that I'm teaching in the methods class, and they come to the graduate program with their political possibilities and imaginations and ideologies, as motivating factors for how to make the world a better place and how to create change. And so I think that thinking about research methods, equipping students with research methods is really about equipping them with the critical thinking skills and reasoning skills to be able to enact good research design with the priorities of the communities and the preferences of the communities that they're working with and the ethical obligations to the communities. And I think that sometimes in research methods, we can see those things as at odds with each other, or we could see those things as ways to mitigate risk or, see them in sort of a negative light. But I think that increasingly, especially in these times of crises, they really shine a light on how research methods, are really like a conversation with community groups, and that those conversations make research projects better, like was said by someone at the beginning of this conversation, and I think that times of crises really kind of show the power of those partnerships very well.
Yeah, and thanks so much for bringing up, graduate students, because I think for many of us, who are working with graduate students, we're really feeling for them in this moment and navigating, their decisions to be in graduate school and the futures that they're looking at. So such a crucial part of our, teaching publics to be thinking about. Patricia, your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, for real. I think, one thing that, as I'm listening to Steve and Naomi talk, I'm thinking about context and politics as the political context of the state that you're operating in. And I think that one of the things that not from everyone in our state, no state is totally monolithic, but I think that what can be understood as the public that ought to be served and the way in which it ought to be served, it can be very fraught. Those conversations can be fraught when things, especially when things garner, when research projects garner attention from particular state level politicians that don't want to see us doing particular types of work. And so, the notion of having some of our collaborative and community-oriented work be reacted to by members of our state legislature with something like, with, wow, that's a university being useful, is, sort of a dream in my mind to hear. But I think the other thing that I wanted to say, which is sort of disconnected from that, is just that, teaching methods in the classroom, in a grad feminist methods or qual methods class, which are the ones that I tend to teach, I try to introduce the idea of that all research should be, anti-oppressive or action-oriented in some respect, right? But to let that look different in different cases, especially when I'm teaching students, in a feminist methodologies class where I have students from all across the disciplines. But that, I still go back to this core insight that starting with the everyday world as the problematic, or that, or like as Steve and Naomi are saying, starting with the interests of community partners is really a core way to make that happen. Another thing that comes up often, so I would say okay, so in the classroom, I try to be a little bit more flexible with what that looks like and let it be led by the particular students. In some of our funded work, we, expect student projects to have community partners. And those honestly have been some of the most creative and fruitful projects that we've seen, people working with local libraries to create kind of outreach groups in small communities in Georgia, creating, community book clubs, working on issues of food deserts and community wellness, working with local artists to do murals, creating public facing story maps, all of these things that are engaged or, in some respects, either co-creative or at the very least having, sort of public facing components. And so that has been really enriching to see kind of what people have come up with. I think that, when we talk about ethics, and maybe this is the last thing I'll say here, is yeah, one of the things I'm really trying in my classes to get students to think about is, obviously to think beyond the IRB. But I feel like I've had, there's a trend among certain students where like ethics, the ethical approach to research sort of ends with paying participants. And I just like so want to get over, it's like my main objective as an instructor for the remainder of my career, I feel like, is to get students to think beyond paying participants and when they're thinking about ethics and issues of and instead thinking about issues of reciprocity and collaboration and co-creation, because I think that that's the research that creates transformation.
Awesome. Well, our final question, I think, is really just kind of serves as an opportunity for each of you to just kind of offer some closing remarks before we move to Q&A. But the question was, how would you characterize the urgency of investing in sociological research methods courses at this moment? Like, is there a perceived or real urgency around this? I know it's part of our core curriculum, but like, is this a time where we are really, feel a greater urgency around this? And if so, what's driving that? And what goals would you describe for making the investments of our time and energy in teaching research methods? Patricia, you're off mute. I'm going to call on you.
Oh, okay. That's what I got. I have just very briefly, I think it's a real urgency. I mean, I think like all the urgencies are real right now. And, to the extent that we are invested in teaching methods in order to, in order to tell less false stories about our social reality, as Sandra Harding, put it, our work is more urgent than ever. And I think that the goals for this investment are nothing less than our collective survival.
Thank you. Steve?
Well, I mean, so absolutely. But we always have to ask urgent for whom? Like, who is it urgent for? Like I'm not about to lose my job compared to like lecturers who are, librarians who just got laid off, our community partners who are being detained, right? So, like, we have to think about like how do we explain the urgency? So to me, it's not urgency to teach methods, it's the urgency for us to respond. But when they don't like our politics, we know they don't like our rights, they go after our methods. So our methods, as we're engaged and we are explicitly engaged, we have to be that much more rigorous to defend what we're doing. And so we have to be really sharp because they are going to go after you. They are going to, request your records. They are going to do all this. So you have to be really clear. Make sure you're protecting your informants and your community partners. Make sure you're not writing down names. Make sure that you're keeping things separate, right? So I think it's urgent because the political moment is urgent for our partners and our community. So I think that's for me where the urgency is. The urgency for the university and why that in ours should we prioritize is that the university is under attack. We do have to demonstrate that we are serving the public in my case, and that there is actually a way to do that, right? By actually putting research, in that kind of public mission. So if we are a public serving institution and that's where the crisis is, then we need to think, and for me, the urgency is we are in this privileged position. So how do we, and we tell this both to funders, we tell it to our administrators, anyone to listen, and our communities, like only when we start to bend and apply our skills and resources at the disposal to those who are really are in crisis, are we going to win back any trust of the public? When does it think about like how much more the public trust community colleges In my area, when I ask people locally, what's your college? What's your higher education? They all point to the community college or the state college, but not the UC in their backyard, right? So if we're gonna like be able to claim that we're doing things for the public good, ask the public, in what way. And so I think that's where the urgency is, but it connects to methods because how we go about doing that kind of work matters.
Awesome. Thanks. Naomi.
Yeah, I will circle back to the remarks at the beginning where, about this crisis moment of really retreat from data, information, and the perspectives of vulnerable, marginalized people, and really the dominance of a certain, like institutional or administrative narrative about how things are going. So in that context, I feel like there is such a critical need for information, for credible information, for data that represents diverse perspectives, not from the powerful only. And so, that really undergirds this feeling that we need good research methods, high quality, robust research methods in the classroom for undergrads who are consumers and critical consumers, and for graduate students who are going to be the producers of that information. And I'll also say specifically for sociological research methods, I think it's very important because sociologists are so, they are so aware about about data as power, knowledge as power, and about institutions and the role of institutions in structuring the data and that power. And so I think there's a special need for sociologists to be doing this work that have, that sort of very keen awareness and focus on representation in doing their work.
Well, thanks so much to all of you. That's the end of our sort of formal questions, and I see we do already have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and folks are welcome to put more questions into the Q&A for our panelists to address. And I can kick it off here with the first question that I see here is from Josephine, asking, how do other researchers discuss AI and classroom assignments, i.e. cognitive offloading or using AI for summary of sources? So I know, Patricia, you're the one that brought AI up. I won't call on you, but is there a panelist that wants to speak some to this question around AI in the classroom?
It's such a struggle, it's such a struggle. But I do think like there is something, since we're talking about methods, there is something about methods classes that can make it easier in some respects to design assignments that are harder. Well, I don't even want to say that because every time I say anything about what I think is not AI proof, but is maybe AI resistant, I get proved wrong. But I do think like when you're doing like a multi-step project, that's a methods project, you're engaging with community partners or other participants, I think that students often get behind that work and and it's work that you actually have to do. So like that helps at least with methods classes. I do, I've had like some not really current students, but former students, suggest using AI to analyze data. And I just like am completely ethically opposed to that on multiple levels, and I don't think it gives you good results either. And so I think having conversations about that is really important. And I guess like some people I know have designed activities to kind of prove that to students, but then those activities also require using the AI platforms, which feels dicey to me.
So many layers and complications to that. Either Steve or Naomi, any comments on that topic?
Just quickly, I've been reading, I'm teaching a senior seminar, and the students have to go out, and it's on Allison Pugh's The Last Human Job, and I thought she does a good job of discussing AI, like what it can't do, and what's particularly, and it's the interactiveness, right? The connective labor where something more comes out. So, AI, it can solve some good enough problems, like, but you have to think, well, why is it, do we're so harried we need to use AI. Well, let's step back and think it's not because, AI can solve it, is our, we have these other problems. And so in terms of connective labor and working with students, for example, like it is an institutional, what she calls the social architecture, the problem that makes it harder. We're not paid enough, we don't have enough time. So then we end up going toward, using AI, and she's like, step back. How do we create a social architecture where, that we don't need that good enough, kind of labor. But the other way I think is really the quality. So having students go out and for their class, they're looking at a particular occupation. So you could do research and, collect data on what's an occupation. What is it really like? They have to shadow and talk to people. And it's through the interviews that we talk about this practice of connective labor with somebody to learn about it. And then they get to compare, what did I learn about being a lawyer by, using AI? And what did I learn by talking to a lawyer and shadowing a lawyer? So for me, it's like, yeah, how do you kind of do things where it's kind of not AI proof? There could be AI parts of it, like, but it's shallow, right? It's barely scratching the surface of what's really useful. And so I think students get like, huh, okay, there's only so much I can learn from that kind of stuff. And there's a particular assignment where but I think that reading the book around connective labor and what makes the interaction so important, doing something in connection with someone that creates something else is what AI can't do yet, maybe, or it's
Yeah.
still one way, right? Kind of this way. It's not this mutual construction. So if we think about co-construction, that's where it absolutely breaks down.
Keeping the human in the, in the collaboration seems key. Naomi?
Yeah, I just want to say that I am, this is constantly a challenge, I think, and a struggle for myself as I think about designing my classes. And I've tried various, I see AI as a tool for certain contexts, I think, which is similar to what Patricia and Steve are both saying. And it can be very helpful. So I don't shy away from it because I do think it's really important to equip students with knowledge about how to use AI, but trying to figure out how to best incorporate that into the classroom and into assignments is something I'm very much still trying to figure out. And I've had some pretty I would say kind of failures in the recent past where I've tried to encourage students to use it and then got some terrible work submitted. So I'm still trying to figure it out generally. But I will say that in general, with some of the like algorithmic or automated tools, I've had, I do have some success with some of those. And I just want to put in a plug for Perusal, which I've been using in my graduate methods class, and I've used in some of my undergrad classes as well. That I think that in my methods, this is a tool that I think many people have that's integrated in their Canvas platform. But it's a way to encourage students to do deep reading and to make comments and for other students to see those comments and to get grades on it with you can use the perusal function for that. And now I'm sounding like I'm paid by perusal, but I'll just say that I think that in my grad methods classes, particularly, this is the third year I'm using it, and it really supports deep conversation about methods and about articles and about choices that researchers made about different things. And you can kind of get past the surface level discussion that you would normally have in a class and really get into these sort of deep topics. And so I am very thankful for that one tool that I feel like is pretty consistently helpful for me.
Oh, that's great to hear. Now I have to check that one out. We have one more question in the Q&A at this point. This is coming from Richard asking, I'm curious about teaching epistemological assumptions behind the methods and what that looks like for different audiences, such as undergraduate versus graduate students in particular. I feel like those are important conversations to have, but for those who struggle to even define the word epistemology, I find it hard to have those conversations be productive. So, who has thoughts on helping those conversations be productive around epistemology?
I mean, I could say a couple of things, and I do think it's hard, like no question that it's hard, and what it looks like with undergrads is very different from what it looks like with grad students. I think that two tools that have conceptual tools that have been really useful to me, except now I'm having like a brain fart and I can't remember the name of one of them. But Du Bois's double consciousness is really, I think, a really helpful tool for teaching about epistemology and questions of, what is knowledge, what can be known, who is a knower, and recognizing that those questions exist within systems of power. That has been really effective for me, both with undergrads and with grad students. And similarly, some of Dorothy Smith's early work on feminist sociology is similarly useful, where she talks about, women, and of course she talks about this as a monolithic category, which is problematic, but women having to step outside of themselves in order to and see themselves from the perspective of the other in order to understand themselves within the dominant perspective of knowledge. And those tools have been useful for opening up for students kind of a more critical eye to the assumptions going into how knowledge is built and how they might build knowledge differently. With grad students, depending on the course, I mean, I think that you can go into greater depth about different methodologies and, compare their epistemological assumptions, to greater depth. But I don't think that grad students are always particularly thrilled to do that any more so than undergrads are.
Great. Any additional comments from the panel on that question? It's a tough one.
Yeah, I might just echo both the motivation for the question and Patricia's answer. And I'll say that I think that just in some concrete ways, I think it does often come about through initial sort of discussions around positionality. So this is very similar to what Patricia's talking about, but that sometimes can be easier opening that then broadens into these bigger sort of conversations about truth and knowledge. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, I don't see any additional questions. I guess last call. If you have a quick question, put it in the Q&A. Otherwise, I do want to just again offer our thanks to our wonderful panelists for joining this conversation today. I know my brain is inspired and also spinning in multiple directions as I continue to sort through these questions, and I'm sure that's true for everyone here. I do just want to say too that we are at First Publics. We are an online community of practice focused on teaching as a vital form of public sociology. We are a website, which I hope I'm putting in the chat for everyone if I know what I'm doing. And we welcome your contributions. So, you know, we try to reach out to folks, but we also welcome people to submit things. We have multiple different ways to contribute, including writing slightly longer reflections that are more like 800 words, or short things that we call class notes that really are meant to kind of get at some of these questions around, well, how are we trying to do these things in the classroom, and what does that look like? And then broader conversations, dialogues akin to these webinars and other conversations that we have with folks that are out doing this work in higher ed in all its various forms. So yeah, we welcome you to keep joining the conversation at First Publix, and thank you again for attending today. And seeing no further questions, I think we'll go ahead and sign off. So thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.